Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everybody, and welcome to Pangolin, the conservation podcast, the show dedicated to exploring and amplifying the world's underappreciated conservation stories. The stories that inspire me, and I hope will inspire you too. I'm your host, Jack Baker, and thank you for joining me for another wonderful, amazing, hopefully very, very inspiring, brilliant, incredible, wonderful episode of Pangolin Pride, our series highlighting voices and stories from the LGBTQ plus community. And today things are really heating up. I'm sorry, that's a terrible joke, but they're heating up because we are here to talk about the impact of fire on wildlife, which I'm so excited to do because we've never done anything like this before, and it's brilliant and it's wonderful, and I am joined by the most incredible guest to do it. I am joined by the absolutely brilliant Kendall Calhoun, whose work focuses on helping to understand how extreme climatic events, such as megafires, are impacting wildlife in California. We discuss climate justice, the ability of different species to respond to changes in fire patterns, and how these fires impact incidences of human-wildlife conflict as well. So, what happens when a place burns down? What happens to the large predators that are in that area? What happens to the bears or the kind of mountain lions or these kind of large predatory species? Where do they go? And what happens? So we talk about that as well, and it's really, really interesting. And all these things, like I say to Kendall in the episode, I am so glad this isn't my problem to think about because I have no idea how you would even begin to unpick it, but he does such a good job of trying to understand those things and explaining those things to us, and I am just so grateful. Like, it's one of those episodes where I'm like, I'm so glad I talked to you because I feel like I've just had a one-on-one, like, perfect tuition and introduction to this topic, and it's just amazing, and I have got to record it for a podcast, and now all you guys get to enjoy it as well. Kendall's just, I can't say enough good things. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. So yes, having built him up far, like, so big, so big, I will let him talk because he's just brilliant. I know you're going to love it. So happy Pride Month. I hope you're enjoying the series. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our future kind of episodes. And without further ado, let's get started. And welcome back to the show. I am now joined by Kendall Calhoun, a postdoctoral researcher who is studying the impact of climactic disturbances on wildlife. And I am so excited that you're joining us because when I was looking for guests for this series, your name stuck out and the work that you do stuck out because I don't think we've talked about anything like this on the show before. So I'm excited. I know the listeners will be excited. And so the first thing I have to say is thank you so much for joining me today, Kendall.
Oh, thank you. I'm very happy to be joining this series too. I think it's so important, and very excited to be part of the group.
Thank you. It was a bit like when I was looking for guests, I feel like I've like assembled like some kind of like conservation Avengers because the group is so strong of like amazing people. It's like I love them all. I know. So and I'm sure you, as people will learn about your research, they'll be like, this person fits exactly within that group of amazing people. And well, I guess having built up your ego just a little bit there, I have introduced you and said a very basic, I guess, introduction of what you do. But I always like to kind of hand it over to the guest and say, like, who are you? Tell us a little bit about yourself. Introduce yourself to the listeners because you know yourself far better than I do. So, yeah, could you tell us a little bit about who you are and, a little bit about you?
Yeah. So I'm Kendall. I grew up in the Central Valley of California. So very kind of suburban growing up. I didn't get to see a lot of, Black or queer scientists at all. So when I got to college, I wasn't really quite sure what I wanted to do. And it kind of took going out on a limb to try, like, what is this ecology thing? What's animal science? And I really just fell in love like really quickly. And since then, been training to be a wildlife biologist and global change biologist. And now I study how mostly wildfire influences um, native wildlife species here in California, how changes in climate and changes in wildfire and other disturbances are impacting wildlife around the world, and then also how climate change is influencing our interactions with wildlife. So, like human wildlife conflict. Um, yeah.
The perfect introduction because it has really set up, I think, some of the different things we're going to talk about and some of the things we're going to kind of draw out a little bit more as we kind of go through the conversation. So that is, yeah,
Okay,
that's
great.
perfect. And I guess something that I kind of always like to ask though as a follow up to that is like, that's a really I'm always intrigued just by like how people get to studying exactly what they're studying, right? Because I think especially like in research, there are a endless number of
Infinite.
questions about an endless number of topics, about an endless number of things that people could kind of ask about and think about and want to talk about and kind of get into. And so I wondered, like, before we actually talk about your work and some more about exactly what it is that you do, I wondered, like, could you tell us maybe a little bit about how you got to this topic in the first place? Like, what was it that kind of drew you in to the conservation kind of wildlife space, or what was it that drew you to this
Mm.
topic? Like, yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot. So maybe two parts. I think when growing up, I was always interested kind of in animals and nature, but I never ever saw kind of an opportunity to make it a career. um, and going into college, I had a couple friends who were a little more sure about, like, they wanted to be one wanted to be a vet, another one wanted to do like research, and I was like, oh, what is this stuff? So I took a couple of classes just again out on a limb and realized that um, you know learning about the crisis of biodiversity around the world really motivated me in undergrad
Mhm.
to actually like commit a lot of my life to trying to solve some of the issues that are really present both for me in California, but also like broadly around the world for wildlife. um, and I still feel like us as people around the world have a commitment, or we should have a commitment to restoring a lot of the damage that we've caused to the natural world, and in doing so, also, serving justice to communities that have been, also marginalized by the same effects that are hurting the planet. And I think those really go hand in hand. And then the second part of that is that after undergrad, I really wanted to do research that was relevant to home. I'm from California. I wanted to do work that was really relevant to California. And over the past couple years or decades, there's been such a crazy escalation in wildfire here in California, but in so many other places around the world. And it's been glaringly clear that very little research has gone into understanding how these growing fires influence wildlife and wildlife communities to potentially, I don't know, we don't really understand what the long-term kind of ramifications of that might be. So that really motivated me to do this specific research. Um, and yeah, I'm kind of just, yeah, following my interest wherever it may lead.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I mean, that's a very just, like letting the kind of curiosity in those things that like are important to you lead what you want to do. I think is, yeah, I think a really relatable kind of story because I think, yeah, I guess I was the same in terms of like, I feel like there's some people who just get lucky and they know when they're kind of from the moment they kind of walk into school, they're like, I want to be a doctor or a vet
Oh,
or a nurse or whatever it is. And I was like, I don't know. And then went to uni to do something completely unrelated and then somehow ended up back doing kind of research in conservation and impact and kind of the
great.
impact of conservation and stuff. So yeah, and then yes, I also love the fact that you brought up the kind of the fact that like the kind of justice aspect of this as well, because I think sometimes there's that disconnect, right? Especially when people are dealing with things that are typically like physical geography kind of, or physical like scientific issues in terms of fire could be classified in that
Mm,
kind of way.
hmm.
There's sometimes a disconnect in research between that and the justice narratives, and that are, but you're right in that like they both kind of go together and need to go together. And I guess I'm getting ahead of myself in terms of we might bring this up as we go into the research, but I think
Yeah,
it's a
yeah.
really important thing to flag now because it's such an important discussion that I think will probably come up throughout as like, yeah, something that like, yeah, I think is really, really interesting and important. Really, really interesting. Um and yeah, I guess to save me going, I feel like, yeah, I was going through and just bullet pointing, going that agree with everything. Yep, agree. Yep, 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 yep. But before I just waste all our time doing that, I think like, something that I kind of wanted to ask then is like, we've kind of hinted at it a little bit as you've been kind of talking of like, oh, this is a really important thing, and there wasn't really kind of much study into it. And yeah, so your research is about kind of, yeah, these kind of climatic events and fire. And I wondered kind of if we could talk before we kind of look into the specific kind of questions and things that you've kind of brought up. I guess taking a step back, why, like, it might sound like a very silly basic question, but why are these things an important thing? How did these kind of things interact with wildlife, and why in a conservation kind of naturey setting should we be talking about these kind of things? I guess is the question ultimately.
Hmm. Well, I would say that wildfire specifically in California and other parts is so embedded in the natural history of a lot of these ecosystems. So indigenous groups in California and many other places around the world use prescribed burning and other burning practices, cultural burning, to create a lot of the ecosystems that are around us today. And a lot of the wildlife that is in those ecosystems really depend on those kind of established fire cycles. And those are specific to different, ecosystems, vegetation types, and wildlife groups. Um, and the way that climate change is influencing those established patterns has potentially unknown effects on how those wildlife are able to respond or not respond. So, in many cases, fire can renew like a lot of resources or vegetation for wildlife. There's been a lot of work looking at deer and other species that can benefit from using fire. But in recent years, we now have these megafires that are extremely large, like over 100,000 acres. Sorry, that's I guess a U.S. unit. Um, um, and they're much more severe than historical fires in the past. So they're burning vegetation all the way down to the ground instead of doing kind of a mixed burn and creating new habitat. It's all kind of being converted into almost like a moonscape potentially. And that kind of only favors a very subset few of species that are able to use that kind of transformed habitat. And I think to me, the potential looming threat is that the landscapes that have been established by these different fire characteristics are going to be overrun by repeated megafires, where we're not able to support the diversity of species we once were able to because all of the ecosystems have been converted into these like fire prone, fire crazy landscapes. Um, and that potentially could have consequences for conservation of certain species that depend on those landscapes. Um, yeah, so I also think that losing potential ecosystems from this conversion is also going to be difficult for people because we depend on a lot of those ecosystems as well. In California, I talk a lot about oak woodlands and rangelands and how important they are for both wildlife and for industry, like winemaking and like livestock raising. But those practices are dependent on the natural cycles that are maintained in large part by fire. So learning how climate change is influencing our fire cycles here, and then trying to take that into account in ways that we can better protect these ecosystems for the future is super important for both, conservation of wildlife and for sustainable livelihoods in these like increasingly fire prone places.
Mhm. Yeah, it's really really interesting, and it's something that's really interesting to me. I think, especially because like it's as you say, it kind of affects both those things. And I think previously, I guess not up until recently, I would say, but up until kind of like I guess when I started my PhD, I started talking to there's a student who kind of works in the building, kind of the same building as me, who's studying fire, and kind of I think a lot of people and a lot of people listening to this might be thinking of fire as a purely destructive thing for wildlife, right? There's this like thing of like I guess whenever it's portrayed, or a lot of the time when it's portrayed in films and on TV, and kind of this, it's sweeping and destructive and killing and awful. But it's that kind of like interesting thing that you are kind of talking about, right? Of this thing of like, well, actually, it's really important for these cycles. And it only becomes this kind of major issue, I guess, when it becomes out of control and exaggerated and kind of this thing. That's
Yeah.
really interesting.
And that
Like,
that actually was like one of my, just like the curiosity of that was one of the interests that got me into doing it for my PhD, because it was it's so interesting that it's like a natural process that everything depends on, but it's almost like too much. It's like too much of a good thing becomes a bad thing. So yeah, a lot of my work now is trying to tease apart kind of the what is good versus bad fire. How can we encourage more good fire to like reduce the effects or chances of bad fire happening?
mhm.
Um,
Yeah, yeah, I think that's really like that's really really interesting actually, because like yeah, it's really really interesting, and the way that it was kind of making me think about like if we were to think of fire as like any other thing, right? Like any plant in an ecosystem, any animal in an ecosystem, great, until its population becomes uncontrolled or not right, or there's too many, or there's too little, or there's too this, or there's too that. So like thinking it of as thinking of think why can I not say that sentence? Thinking of it in that way is actually kind of like I don't know, kind of an interesting way to kind of think about it. And I guess like yeah, you've also provided a very nice segue, I guess, into the kind of research that you're doing and kind of the things that kind of the questions you're asking. And so I think I would be silly not to take that and ask, like, yeah, so like having thought about that as this major kind of issue, which seems like there are probably it's one of those topics that come up on the show where I'm like, I'm really glad someone's looking into this, but I'm glad it's not my problem to think about, because I think I would there's so many questions there that I would end up trying to think about.
yeah.
But like, yeah, like what specifically do you look into to do with this topic? And like, yeah, what are the questions you're kind of focusing on?
Yeah, there's a couple of different angles. Like as you said, there's infinite kind of ways to ask about how fire is influencing wildlife. But one of the major ways I've been looking at this is try to understand and try to describe the characteristics of fire that are beneficial for ecosystems and the characteristics that are bad. So a lot of that has to do with fire severity, so how intensely the fire is burning, how large the fire is, and then also like how the dynamics of how it burns. So fire in most cases is better if it's patchy instead of it burning like completely homogeneously. Um, and to do that, I'm using biodiversity monitoring tools. So camera traps and acoustic monitors to look at how mammals and birds are using different habitat after it burns. And then trying to associate, um, those different severities and sizes and patchinesses to where and what wildlife like to use. And then we can hopefully use that to, give to management, like wildlife managers and land managers, to use potentially prescribed burning and other kind of land management tools to try to create those effects in the future, um, to be beneficial to wildlife. And I think a lot of those kind of management tools can also mitigate or like reduce the chances of megafires from happening too. So like a major kind of way that this ends up happening is that there's been a kind of buildup in a lot of the fuel in most of the woodland and forested places in California and other places. And using prescribed burning can clear some of that fuel before a natural fire burns all of it all at once and it becomes a megafire. So it's a little more controlled. Um, Another piece of my work is to look at how wildfires potentially influencing how people interact with wildlife around the fires. So there's been some cool work looking at how potentially after really bad fires, certain wildlife species are going to be pushed to more human dominated areas because those natural spaces are less, you know, they have less habitat, usable habitat for them. And that means that people and wildlife are going to be overlapping more often if like they can't get the resources they need from that forest that just burned completely. And that can lead to conflict potentially. Um, in California, there's a lot of talk about how black bears come into conflict with people and you know come come into their garbage to like get food or go into their houses even. And I'm interested to see how fire might be influencing that behavior as well. Potentially, if we can reduce the number of like really bad fires and increase the number of beneficial fires, then maybe black bear, as one example, will like move from using those human dominated areas so intensely to again using the more forested or natural areas. Um, so yeah, two kind of things: trying to see how species are resilient to fire, and then also trying to see how fire influences human wildlife conflict.
Mm-hmm. That has opened 100 questions that I
Sorry.
want to ask and 100 thoughts that I'm like, okay, there's so many things here that I want to just spill out all at once, but I'm like trying to think of what's the best way to ask these things. Um, but no, I guess like if we do them one after the other, and then I can try and form my thoughts for the second one while I'm thinking about the first one as well. Um, I guess like yeah, so like the first point you made about kind of the species that kind of how you can monitor and use these different things to kind of see the kind of severity of fire. That's really interesting, and I think it's kind of like are there things that like I guess there's not the kind of question I'm thinking of is like is there like an are you looking for like, oh, there's an optimum kind of like this is the kind of fire for each area, and like these are the species we're looking to see, like, or
Yeah.
is it like some years this is better, some years that is better, like how do you begin to like understand that? That seems like a complicated but interesting kind of
Yeah.
dynamic. Mhm.
It's very complicated, but I know as I do a lot of community ecology, so that's kind of my jam. Like it's very complex because there's multiple species you're trying to conserve or manage or understand how all of the dynamics are working together. And in some cases it can be species specific. So a lot of the work I do is focused on how black-tailed deer respond to fire because they're a really important ecological species, and they're very important economically for the state. A lot of people care about black-tailed deer, so understanding how fire influences their density, uh, like population and behavior, has been like a really important part to my work. But then you can go past there and understand how fire is influencing their predators, so like mountain lions and black bears and coyotes, and also how it's influencing the species that cohabitate with all those. So mostly in my work, I try to look at how overall diversity of the mammal and bird community is influenced by these different kind of characteristics of fire. So, um, in one study, we were able to find that like moderate severity fires are able to increase the diversity of bat and bird species in this oak woodland landscape. So that could be a finding that could potentially inform how we use fire in those areas to try to, replicate that effect in a more controlled way. That's not necessarily a megafire. And like you mentioned, a lot of it also has to do with like seasonality, like how often are you burning? Sometimes you don't want to burn every year at the same spot because some plants are really sensitive to that. So knowing also the biology of the plants in that system is critical to understanding how you can use fire most effectively to benefit the wildlife too. um, and yeah, also seasonality. So like when in certain seasons, like when deer have fawns or babies, it might be better to like wait to burn or burn earlier so that there's additional resources for them. So just understanding, yeah, kind of all of these like together, I think is important to developing kind of management tools that can benefit the most. But of course, you could do targeted ones too, like I mentioned for potentially deer.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting, and I think it's interesting that like kind of yeah, it kind of trying to balance this whole thing like in a system that was at one point probably balanced and functioned very trying to rebalance that and not do too much and not do too little like
Yeah,
must be quite challenging, right? Because some species will be probably easier to bounce back and if you make if there's maybe a small like oh like there was too much fire one year like some things will bounce back. That's it's really yeah, it's a
yeah.
complicated really interesting sounding kind of puzzle. Like are there some species that you've worked with where you're like these ones like not will be fine, but these ones are more resilient. And there's some that you're like, it's essential we get this right because these ones are really unaffected or on the edge. Like,
Yeah.
is there kind of some for both those categories? I guess.
Yeah, yeah. So overall, I would say most in the research I've done, most of the species we've examined have been pretty resilient. And I think that has to do with the fact that they've evolved with fire in the background already. So they have there's some level of like adaptation to fire underlying all of this. Um, but yeah, some species are more vulnerable to others, like gray squirrel, a lot of the ground nesting birds we found, um, and a lot of the like seed eating birds. So basically, like when really severe fires go through and it removes a lot of the seed bearing plants, a lot of those bird species, and I would argue probably a lot of the rodents, like and squirrels, um, are not able to keep up or like get kind of the food they need to survive, at least in the short term. Um, and then one species we found that is really resilient is coyote, which it seems like coyote are just they're resilient to everything. So it's yeah, very interesting though because I don't know. I have this other interest in understanding what kind of traits of different species lend them to being more resilient to different things, and I think it makes sense that coyotes are so adaptable. They live in cities, in woodlands, forests, like anywhere. They can adapt to basically any disturbance. It seems like so. It's kind of proving this point that even megafires, coyotes can make do. And then one thing that I thought was really interesting is that a lot of the large predators actually they look like they hightail out of the really severely burned areas after big megafires. And this is kind of I think this needs more research, more because it seems like a lot of these larger predators have really big home ranges, so they don't necessarily have to stay in these burned areas after it happens. They can probably move, and some of that movement is potentially into, cities or like more urban areas. But I think it's also interesting in that now, predator populations are already struggling more so than they were in the past. So I'm almost afraid that fire is like accentuating some of the existing challenges predators are already facing by like carving out even smaller pieces of habitat that they have to use, and then potentially increasing conflict with people that are also cohabitating those smaller places. So yeah, very like complicated interworking, but it seems like those species are maybe the winners and losers, but definitely more, I think more work needs to be done.
Yeah, yeah. I guess that also like it bridges nicely into that kind of human wildlife conflict kind of thing that we kind of mentioned there, right? Because yeah, as these things get, especially the large predators, I guess, get kind of pushed and pushed and pushed and kind of moved around, they're going to come into contact. And I think what's interesting, and I was trying to think before we came on, like what are examples of like when I've seen fire and the impact of like of fire on wildlife? What are the stories that like I remember seeing? like most prominently in the news or most prominently kind of in newspapers here, like, and I think what's kind of interesting is like I think a big example that I was thinking about was kind of like in Australia when there was the kind of the bushfires
The
and things.
koalas.
The wildlife was used as a way to be like, look how awful these fires
Yeah.
are. Look how sad. Like it was not. It was never given that kind of conflict narrative ever. Really, that I saw. It was always like wildlife, sad, burning, awful, awful, awful. Like feel sorry, donate, do these things. And so it's interesting to think about it. But at the same time, in Australia, I guess there's not the bears
Yeah, it's
and
like
there's
a
not like these like so like in your context it's very different, right? And so
Mm.
like I wondered like yeah, how do you see these kind of do you see these stories emerging more about conflict, like how like yeah like how like yeah, could we talk a little bit more about that because that's quite interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a very, very new kind of field in theory. So I think logically it makes sense, and then like there's so much anecdotal evidence of like around certain urban areas here in California, like Lake Tahoe and LA, where after either fires or droughts, they're having or intermittent with all these different disturbances or having issues with coyotes coming into the city or bears coming into the city. But I do think it's really dependent, as you kind of were talking about, on one, like the traits of the species. So yeah, if you have large predators, they might be a bigger conflict issue than like
Yeah,
I don't know if people are going to care if a koala is like
yeah.
crawling into their yard. Maybe they will. I don't know. But then also just like how people perceive wildlife, like the I don't know if tolerance is the right word, but like kind of like cultural norms about what is acceptable, I guess, for how we coexist with wildlife. So I think that I don't do as much work there, but I think that is a really important piece on how people perceive nature and wildlife and how we can potentially coexist better. Um, for the traits like big predators, I think especially for mountain lion or puma, when the big fires happen, it removes a lot of the vegetation that they use for ambushing. So they can't actually get their native prey deer as easily because there's no cover for ambushing. So I think the alternative becomes getting livestock potentially in areas that are nearby the fire, and that is I think the major source of conflict for a lot of the larger predators, at least here in California, and I think it has to be true. I think for other places in the world where they're also facing fire or drought or
Mhm.
other disturbances through climate change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's really really interesting. Yeah, yeah, that's really really interesting. And I think like yeah, it's yeah, there's definitely like someone's PhD or someone's research project in that, I guess, of like trying to get like really deep and try to understand like the difference between these kind of things and like get really into it. Like, or just you can keep digging and digging and digging. Like I feel like there's so many like it's so interesting. It's so interesting. And I guess like I suppose, like, we kind of touched on it a little bit, but like, I guess does that kind of connect in, or maybe not directly connected, but it kind of connects in my mind into these kind of issues of kind of justice, where it comes into these kind of like these questions, I guess, that it starts to raise of like which species, the deer, as we kind of talked about, because they're economically important, kind of like they're important, but that like so they kind of get this kind of they're probably thought about a lot. Then there's the carnivores and kind of the large predators are kind of an issue, and I guess then all of these things also impact on people because then you also have well, who did the deer benefit and who did the kind of bear threaten, and then who ultimately's homes are destroyed or whose places are kind of like, and so all of these kind of things start to swirl together in my mind, and I don't know if you had, I guess, more to say on that, or like if there was if I completely mis summarized that in my brain
No,
or these
no,
questions that are wrong, but like yeah, is there a thought there that might be slightly correct, or like do you have thoughts on that?
no. I think that
uh,
is. I think that is correct, and I think that. I mean, that's it's a complicated answer. I think the way that we approach solving both the issue of protecting wildlife from severe fire and protecting people from severe fire should also kind of incorporate, I guess, a flavor of environmental justice or equity that benefits communities that, I guess, were previously not in these conversations about what species are important, how do we manage these landscapes, and then do you actually get the benefits of like having these species and coexisting with them. And I think some of that is hard because a lot of like fire and a lot of these large predators and conflicts with them is happening kind of in these more natural kind of interface landscapes that are pretty far from cities, and cities are where a lot of the diversity of people are. So I think one thing I would love to do, and I don't know how yet, is to try to connect again, like how people from more diverse backgrounds that might not be living directly amongst like fire and these large predators, have them understand that they are still important to our shared kind of ecosystem, and also maybe improve their perceptions of what like it means to coexist with predators, deer, and fire, so that we can find management tools or um, I don't know, develop policy that can help be like beneficial for everyone potentially, or at least more people, um, and have it not be so much dictated by like a small group of people who have like an interest in deer specifically and not for the predators, because I think all of them are potentially equally important for maintaining kind of the sustainability of the ecosystem. Um, and like you mentioned before, I do think fire is very, in a lot of ways, I think how we perceive fire is very similar to how we perceive predators, and that like there's been, at least here, like a history of antagonism about how we think about fire and how we think about a lot of the predators. So relearning what it means to talk about them and coexist with them, because they are vital to the systems we have, I think is important for future conservation here,
Mhm.
in California.
I think, yeah, I think that's a really good kind of like. I really like that as kind of a. There's so many thoughts that I have, but I think it's also kind of a really good point to kind of looking at the time and looking at the kind of discussion we've had. Like, I think a really good kind of point to kind of start wrapping up this conversation on, because it is like looking forward into these other questions and these things. And I think it kind of, yeah, will give people a lot to think about, a lot to
Yeah.
take away, and I think a lot to kind of, and also you and me probably a lot to go away and go, I did like, and maybe in like a couple years time we can reconnect and go, okay, where are we further on these questions? Because I feel like it's probably a long and interesting process
Yeah.
that's going to take place. But no, that's really really fascinating and really really interesting. I guess like before we move on to the kind of next question, I guess something that kind of I'd like to just take a moment to kind of pause and think about is like, I guess like, so sometimes we have people on this show who talk about like a specific species, right? And listeners can be given very specific advice on this will help this, or this person can help this, or this person, like by doing this, you can help this species, or this number of species, or this thing, or this issue, or you can donate to this project, or whatever. Like, but I wonder with an issue like this, like, is it best to kind of highlight the fact that like this is what all of the efforts to limit climate change are kind of important for, or is that like just a general or is there specific things that people can kind of like reflecting on going, this is a big issue, like is there things that people can do to kind of think about this more?
Yeah.
And
Well, I think one, what you said is true. Like,
yeah.
this is why, working towards mitigating climate change is important, because fire and these other disturbances are really clear, just kind of examples of how climate change is affecting these landscapes. And, climate change can be nebulous sometimes, but I think these megafires are really clear kind of crystallizations of what the on the ground effects can be. Um, But also, I think one of the takeaways I feel is that we collectively cannot not do anything. Like we need to, just as before, like these landscapes have been actively stewarded. Like we can decide how we want these landscapes to look, and we can put in, you know, we can make decisions about what we value in these landscapes, which I would argue should be like biodiversity and sustainability. And those can be involved in how we actually actively work on these landscapes and manage them and conserve them. And that includes fire too. It's not something that has to be out of control. So I encourage people to take an active role in how they, you know, um, interact with the natural world around them. So, I mean, that can be in so many different ways. It could be like voting or through like doing, getting involved with understanding what biodiversity is around you so that you know what species might be in trouble after really big fires or like actions that need to take place. Um, and then also being more aware of the fact that we need to coexist with these different kind of challenges. Um, yeah, and yeah, being more humble about it, I guess. Like,
Yeah, I think that's yes. I think that's a really a very good set of advice, especially given we are both in countries which are going to have big elections this year.
oh
So
yeah,
voting important, being engaged very important.
yes,
Like thinking about these things, thinking about perfect. Yeah, I think a good thing to mention for everybody to kind of go and take away and think about. Um, and I guess also something that kind of links into is quite nicely is the next question I was going to ask, which is kind of about like, this are ways for everyone to get involved, but this whole series is about kind of like it's for Pride Month and we are celebrating voices from across the LGBTQ plus community. And kind of something I've been asking everybody is like, a lot of the time, people feel like they don't necessarily belong in this space for whatever reason that may be, whatever experiences they've had or kind of have seen. And so, what I'm kind of the question leading on that I've been asking everybody is kind of what would you say to people who feel like they don't belong in this space and they don't think they should be doing those things? They don't think they can be, but like, how would you encourage people, I guess, to be involved in the kind of conservation space?
no. Well, I think anyone. I think actually all of us should probably be have some kind of. We all have skin in the game. Like I think all of us should be committed in some degree to conservation. But I know that historically what has been called conservation does not reflect, like it reflects a very small subgroup of people. And I, like with my work or my, like I'd love to potentially use kind of my work and place in academia to try to show and build opportunities for others that I guess historically would not be reflected in conservation. Um, and make it clear that there isn't one type of conservationist or scientist that is doing the type of work that is needed. I think, I mean, we talked about this at the beginning, but people have been using it's sorry, it's not called conservation, but people have been doing actions and managing the land for millennia in ways that have made these ecosystems sustainable. I would call that conservation, but maybe they do not. But that's what it is. um, I think making it more approachable for people in the way that there are different ways to get involved as well. So whether it be getting involved in local biodiversity blitzes or also thinking more about how we use resources locally, local to you, could be important to seeing yourself getting involved in conservation as well. Also, being able to see yourself in science in ways that are not already represented, I think, is important. So, whether you're not white or if you're queer, I think there's still a space for you to be in conservation or whatever you want to do. And I think that's becoming more clear. People are more vocal about that now. Um, and I think it's important for especially people that are later on in the career to try to continue to widen the kind of like the door and the opportunities for people to continue to join. Um, so I would say try your best to ignore the kind of othering feeling that often is associated with being out in nature and uh, conservation historically, and really just embrace what it means for you. So I think there are ways that, I don't know, we all have different connections with nature, and I don't think there's a necessarily wrong way of how we feel that connection and why it's important to us and what's valuable to us, um, and just pursue that.
I think that's a really beautiful way to put that, right? It's like, yeah, we all exist at our own intersections and in our own places and in our own kind of spaces and in our own ways and in our own bodies. And so, yeah, the way that we connect with nature is going to be different. And like, yeah, I think the way that you summed it up there. I was going to try and do a recap, but I think you summed it up so beautifully.
Oh,
I don't need to.
sorry.
That was like, yeah,
I was
that was
kind of
that was
meandering.
perfect. No, I think it's nice. I think it's good. It's good. As someone who often meanders through whatever they're saying, I appreciate a good meander. So it was good. It was good. No, I think that's a really, really solid piece of advice. And I guess, like, unfortunately, what it means, like, because it's a very solid piece of advice, it means it's time for the final question of the podcast, which has flown by. Like, I'm looking at the clock and I'm going, how have we gone for 45 minutes already? Like, this is insane. And I sad because I kind of have been really enjoying the chat, but I should ask the final question, despite the fact I could keep this going for another hour. Which is this show, like, we've talked about fire as something that we haven't talked about ever before. We've talked about kind of how people can be involved and kind of find their space. But the whole show, obviously, the underlying theme is kind of this underappreciated nature. And so something I ask every guest to do is pick a species, plant, animal, whatever you want it to be, that people don't know enough about, and don't look at enough, and don't love enough, or don't appreciate, or don't understand, or don't whatever it is. Like, whatever reasons it's underappreciated, it doesn't matter. It just has to be underappreciated. And so, for you, Kendall, what would be an underappreciated species you want to shine a spotlight onto?
Ooh. Well, I kind of already gushed about coyotes,
Yeah.
which I think are just so admirable in the way that they adapt to everything. But one of
Mhm.
my new kind of species that I'm kind of fanning over are beavers, the American beaver.
Good
Yeah,
choice.
they. I don't know if you've had anyone talk about beavers yet on the show, but I don't study them yet, but I think they're potentially amazing for uh, places like California that are really struggling with fire and drought, because they basically create these micro refugia by damming rivers that kind of increase the soil moisture and raise the water table in ways that reduce the risk of megafire. And then also in California, we have this big kind of struggle with multi-year droughts. Those dams can help. They kind of slow down the flow of water across the state potentially in ways that could, you know, reduce how severe droughts are throughout the year. So I think beavers potentially beavers beavers are kind of potential unsung heroes that can do these two tasks just by like doing their natural ecology. And I also think it's interesting. There's been a lot of, we talked about conflict a little bit before, but there's a lot of conflict with beavers as well, because people don't always like that they dam near their homes or near their kind of farmland. Um, so I think there's an interesting dynamic to be talked about like there are really big potential benefits that that beavers could have by reintroduction throughout California in the ways that they reduce these really bad disturbances. Um, but like, how do we do that in a way that is uh, that takes into account kind of the cost that individual people have to, go through to have beavers in their backyard. But yeah, I think they're real cool. I've been trying to see one in nature. Like, I've been going to different national parks trying to find just a sighting, but I've not seen it yet. But they're my new animal crush.
I mean, it makes sense, right? Because they are almost in the opposite to fire. They are like the animal equivalent of fire in that they transform, they change, they move things, they like it, and they use water to do it and wood to do it, which like so it's a real flip of the script, but I think that fits perfectly. And yes, I think one person has mentioned them before, but it was
Oh,
in a UK context, so
okay.
completely different.
Yeah.
Completely different. Doesn't count.
Yeah.
So no, I think an excellent choice. And again, also because they are found in Scotland, we have beavers. Like
Oh.
there is a little bit of bias whenever somebody says them. I'm like, yeah, this is good choice, good choice. And yeah, because can relate to the like growing up in Scotland, seeing the stories about like people being not happy about beavers being on their land or reintroduced or put somewhere or moved somewhere or done this. Like it's a really interesting for something that looks so inoffensive. Like it looks just cute and
They're
fluffy and
cute. Yeah, I was gonna say
wonderful.
they're
Yeah.
cute.
Like yeah, there's a big story there that yeah, I think is the correct choice and gives people even more to go away and think about than they already do. I think we've given them so many things today to think about. We've like overwhelmed them with so many interesting questions and things to do. But yeah, fantastic, brilliant. I guess then that kind of before we wrap up, I will give you an opportunity to say like before I say thank you and all these sorts of things, like if people want to keep up to date with your work or anything we've talked about, learn more, do whatever, is there somewhere they should go to kind of keep up to date with you or any of these projects? Like, yeah, feel
Yeah.
free to plug whatever. This is the time.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I have a website, kendallcalhoun.com, if you want to see what I'm currently working on, and there are links to some of um, my research and some of my outreach materials too. And then also on Twitter, or X, whatever it is. If you want to follow me there, Kenley Calhoun. And yeah, I'll be involved with Black Mammologist Week later this year, so please look out for that. It's a social media campaign that is really working to highlight the contributions of Black conservationists and mammalogists, in line with kind of what we talked about before, just trying to highlight that we exist. And yeah, uh, we have important contributions to make to the field as well, and we're just trying to support each other.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's brilliant, and I will put links to kind of everything, some resources for you, and I'll see if I can find a web page for Black Mammologist Week as well. I'll put something down there so people can like stay up to date, find out when it is, like all these sorts of things, so they can make sure and not miss these things. Because I feel like sometimes I'm like I want to make sure that like yeah, everybody, nobody, nothing gets missed. That would be yeah, that's brilliant. So I'll put links to all of that in the description of the episode so people can go and click and find and follow and do all those amazing things. Um, and while they're down there, there'll be links to our social media at Pangolin Podcast and everything. If they do want to follow, if they're on social media anyway, we're there. And they can subscribe. I should say, you can subscribe, listeners, wherever you are, to the podcast. Just click the subscribe button, give us a nice review. This has been a fantastic conversation, so I think it deserves a 5-star review. If just no bias is involved at all, but maybe you should. Yes, I guess then the last thing I have to say, aside from the kind of promotion of these things, is a huge thank you because this has been a fantastic, really interesting conversation, unlike anything we've covered on the podcast before.
Oh.
I've loved it. I found it so interesting. I think like I always love these ones where I don't know a lot going in because I feel like I'm getting a private one-on-one tuition session that then happens to go out on the internet as a podcast. So it's just been fantastic. So thank you so much, Kendall. It's been brilliant.
Yeah, thank you. I really love talking to you on the podcast, so thanks.
Perfect. And yes, on that note, a huge thank you to the listeners as well for tuning in. I hope you've been enjoying the Pride Month series. We have a couple left. So yeah, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss them. And yes, until next time, thank you again, Kendall. Thank you again, listeners. And goodbye.
Bye.